We live in a divided world of many people's hopes and dreams. Let's learn more about morality together as we continue reading Art of War. Section 10, Terrain. Sun Tzu said, "We may distinguish 6 kinds of terrain, to wit, accessible ground, entangling ground, temporizing ground, narrow passes, precipitous heights, positions of a great distance from the enemy. Ground which can be freely traversed by both sides is called accessible. With regard to ground of this nature, be before the enemy in occupying the raised and sunny spots, and carefully guard your line of supplies. Then you will be able to fight with advantage." Makes sense, right? Like, if there's easy to travel ground, you don't want to be stumbling over bushes and other things. You want to take the easy ground. Take the raised, sunny spots that are easy to navigate. This may predate modern weapons, so conventional wisdom may have considerably changed on this. But anyway, let's move on. Ground which can be abandoned, but is hard to reoccupy, is called entangling. From a position of this sort, if the enemy is unprepared, you may sally forth and defeat him. But if the enemy is prepared for your coming, and if you fail to defeat him, then return being impossible, disaster will ensue. Let's just posit that a swamp could be considered entangling. A marsh, some other kind of difficult to travel ground. It's abandoned, there's nothing there to otherwise prevent your passage, but it's just challenging to move in and out of. When the position is such that neither will gain by making the first move, it is called temporizing ground. Well, hang on. Neither will gain by making the first move. Is this like an enormous open plain, or... Anyway, in a position of this sort, even though the enemy should offer us an attractive bait, it will be advisable not to stir forth, but rather to retreat, thus enticing the enemy in his turn. When part of his army has come out, we may deliver our attack with advantage. So, analogy would be like, don't go chasing after things that aren't of value to you, even if something looks appealing at first. If you don't actually gain anything through having occupied such temporizing ground, I mean, you can use it, but don't prioritize it. With regard to narrow passes, if you can occupy them first, let them be strongly garrisoned, and wait the advent of the enemy. Should the army forestall you in occupying a pass, do not go after him if the pass is fully garrisoned, but only if it is weakly garrisoned. So, yeah, this is the story of naval combat too, right? If armies are fighting and there's a narrow path, you don't want your army to be trapped in the narrow passage. Likewise, you're not going to manage to make it through a narrow passage that's attacked. So, yeah, likewise, if there are narrow passes, I guess scout first. Don't just send your army in. Yeah, I was seeing a documentary talking about Alpha Star. You might have heard of AlphaGo. So Alpha Star being DeepMind's research project as regards to computer gaming and warfare. And I'm sure they use these techniques as well when scouting and being able to make access to perfect information, or imperfect information, but make access to information that's available in many different ways Um, that might be harder for a person to process. Anyway, my point is that scouting and making smart moves is important. Being familiar with the terrain so you know like where are the temporizing grounds, where are the narrow passes, and so forth. Like being familiar with that can help you make good decisions about what to do when and where. Moving on. With regard to precipitous heights, if you are beforehand with your adversary, you should occupy the raised and sunny spots and wait for him to come up. If the enemy has occupied them before you, do not follow him, but retreat and try to entice him away. So, yeah, I'm again thinking of like the Lion King, where there's enormous gorge. And you might have seen this animated sequence where this gorge is occupied on all sides by the villains. Um, so, it dawns on me I probably should not have brought that up because there's more than just that one sequence where they're all singing. But one can imagine like this chasm, this immense place where all the walls are occupied by the enemy at all kinds of heights. You're not going to manage to take advantage of their position there. So, if the enemies arrived there before you with regard to precipitous heights, don't chase and try to entice the enemy away. I don't know how that's going to work. Like, do you offer... What do you offer to try to entice the enemy away? I guess you can feign weakness. It's not like you're going to, like, offer them cookies or supplies or something and they'd take it. I don't know. But, moving on. If you're situated at a great distance from the enemy, and the strength of the two armies is equal, it is not easy to provoke a battle, and fighting will be to your disadvantage. I don't know that that's necessarily true. You're saying if the strength of the two armies is equal, and you're situated a great distance from the enemy, certainly it's not easy to provoke a battle. I don't know that even if the strength of the armies is equal, that's necessarily to your disadvantage to fight. One would say if your opponent is intelligent and well prepared and such, and perhaps better informed on the occasion than you are, you're at no advantage. But I wouldn't necessarily put you at a disadvantage either. But let me read on. Oh, no, that's it. So, there were 6 types of ground. Accessible, which is easy to travel. Entangling, which is not so easy to move in and out of. Temporizing, which is just apparently an enormous plain or something that doesn't offer any strategic value, but does exist. A narrow pass and a precipitous height. And then as a kind of ground, we have positions that are at a great distance from the enemy. One of these seems different than the others, but I assume we'll make better sense of it later on. These 6 are the principles connected with Earth. The general who has attained a responsible post must be careful to study them. Now an army is exposed to 6 several calamities, not arising from natural causes, but from faults for which the general is responsible. These calamities: 1. Flight. 2. Insubordination. 3. Collapse. 4. Ruin. 5, disorganization. 6, rout. It's good I know what most of these words mean. Are we going to see... Okay, yeah. Other conditions being equal. If one force is being hurled against another 10 times its size, the result will be the flight of the former. So, certainly one flees if feasible under conditions where things are not going well. Unless there's some strategic consideration that says we cannot flee, or just absolutely will not flee, which I guess leads to the next point, which when the common soldiers are too strong and their officers are too weak, the result is insubordination. When the officers are too strong and the common soldiers too weak, the result is collapse. That's a profound statement. So not only is there a sense of teamwork instead of like group work, there's a sense that like team's going to have leaders within the army. There's going to be various responsibilities and ranks. And if that structure is too strong or too weak, yeah, these conditions occur. When the higher officers are angry and insubordinate, and on meeting the enemy give battle on their own account from a feeling of resentment, before the commander-in-chief can tell whether or not he's in a position to fight, the result is ruin. That's assuming the wisdom of the general or the commander-in-chief. Like, I don't know. It seems that there's an implication that the commander-in-chief, the general, is wise and knows better than their insubordinates. And generally, you would hope that to be the case. But yeah, if you have top or higher officers that are, I don't know, like, is some explanation offered here as to why the higher officers would be angry or insubordinate? No, I guess there isn't a need to elaborate on that. But the point is that the general doesn't know whether it's time, whether we're in a position to fight or not. But the higher officers take action on their own accord. Qualified by from a feeling of resentment. Okay, this is just not going to be elaborated on here, so I can't comment further on it. Let's move on. When the general is weak and without authority, when his orders are not clear and distinct, when there are no fixed duties assigned to officers and men, and when the ranks are formed in a slovenly, haphazard manner, the result is utter disorganization. I mean, yeah, by definition, if organization's the opposite of all those things, if organization is the result of having clarity of the duties, is the result of having the ranks formed in a well-identified manner instead of a slovenly, haphazard one, of course the opposite would be disorganization. Moving on. When a general, unable to estimate the enemy's strength, allows an inferior force to engage a larger one, or hurls a weak detachment against a powerful one, and neglects to place picked soldiers in the front rank, the result must be rout. Why this qualification and neglects to place picked soldiers in the front rank? What's that there for? So, a rout would be like when you just get absolutely trounced. And, yeah, of course, sending an inferior force to engage a stronger one generally is not going to go well. Or a weak detachment against a powerful one. Ditto. Oh, I see. I misread this. This is a compound statement. Let me reread it. When a general, unable to estimate the enemy's strength, either allows an inferior force to engage a larger one, or hurls a weak detachment against a powerful one and neglects to place picked soldiers in the front rank. In either case, the result must be rout. Okay. Interesting. We'll move on. These are the 6 ways of courting defeat, which must be carefully noted by the general who has attained a responsible post. Okay, this leads back to my earlier question of, like, we're assuming the general is wise. So, yeah, again, this is qualified by a statement that the general has attained a responsible post as a result of their past career, where they tend not to court defeat, where they tend to make wise decisions. And are not just accidentally successful throughout a career, and then it's discovered that they don't know what they're talking about. I'm modestly curious what Sun Tzu would have to say about somebody like that, but that goes well beyond the scope of this work. Moving on, the natural formation of the country is a soldier's best ally, but a power of estimating the adversary, of controlling the forces of victory, and of shrewdly calculating difficulties, dangers, and distances constitutes the test of a great general. He who knows these things and in fighting puts his knowledge into practice will win his battles. He who knows them not, nor practices them, will surely be defeated. If fighting is sure to result in victory, then you must fight, even though the ruler forbid it. If fighting will not result in victory, then you must not fight, even at the ruler's bidding. The general who advances without coveting fame, and retreats without fearing disgrace, whose only thought is to protect his country and do good service for his sovereign, is the jewel of the kingdom. Regard your soldiers as your children, and they will follow you into the deepest valleys. Look upon them as your own beloved sons, and they will stand by you even unto death. If, however, you are indulgent, but unable to make your authority felt, kind-hearted, but unable to enforce your commands, and incapable, moreover, of quelling disorder, then your soldiers will be likened to spoilt children. They are useless for any practical purpose. If we know that our own men are in a condition to attack, but are unaware that the enemy is not open to attack, we have gone only halfway toward victory. If we know that the enemy is open to attack, but are unaware that our own men are not in a condition to attack, we have only gone halfway toward victory. If we know that the enemy is open to attack, and also know that our men are in a condition to attack, but are unaware the nature of the ground makes fighting impracticable, we have still gone only halfway towards victory. So many qualifications. Hence, the experienced soldier, once in motion, is never bewildered. Once he has broken camp, he is never at a loss. You break camp to fight, so it's or you break camp to travel, rather. So, yeah, you camp when it's wise to camp, but once you're in motion, you know what you're doing. Hence the saying, if you know the enemy and know yourself, your victory will not stand in doubt. If you know heaven and know earth, you may make your victory complete. So again, this section was about terrain. Talks about many practical considerations, however obvious in some part. It also gives some wisdom about your army being educated, your generals being educated. If Sun Tzu were around, I would like him to perhaps consider, could you please provide a version of this work that perhaps better aggregates related concerns? I do find it useful and poetic in a way that we're able to weave these points together, but I think we could elaborate further upon them if um, they were structured a bit differently. But again, some of the points about terrain seem so obvious. Like, if if your adversary has the high ground, that's an advantage. Even Star Wars lets you know that. Um, but yeah, I think the most interesting section within this section about terrain is the subsection about 6 calamities. The comparison of insubordination versus collapse. So the former being the high generals, or that, let's see, how was this phrased again? When the common soldiers are too strong and the officers are too weak, the result is insubordination. So the concern is not of the officers rising up against you, the general. It's about the common soldiers rising up against the officers. Or like a bottom-up kind of failing of the organization. But yeah, suffice it to say that if you are not observant of the conditions of the terrain, that you will continue having challenges in other respects, as indicated in this section. So, like, if you can see that you are superior in number, but the terrain does not favor fighting for whatever reason, for example, the adversary has the high ground, or you already have the more favorable ground, or the adversary is able to easily flee and you are being lured into a trap, or things of that sort. Like being able to identify conditions in the terrain where the terrain does not constantly change, right? We aren't in some kind of magical fantasy land where the high ground is suddenly the low ground and so forth. Now, you could argue in more contemporary gaming and battle situations that even the terrain can be in flux. And I think Sun Tzu would have quite a field day talking about fields, if the fields were in flux. Yeah, I don't think I've seen much in the way of either actual combat mentioned in media or in this abstract combat where the terrain itself keeps changing. I'm thinking. It sounds like a fascinating concept, but um, the easiest, most natural projection that we in the West can do is thinking about Western chess. And there are some parts of an 8x8 board, or shogi on a 9x9 board, there's some places that are easier to access than others. Like, this is pretty obvious. Heck, even on a Go board, one can think about like which sections are easiest to corner versus easiest to start running and joining your forces from. I'm curious now. Surely somebody else must have read this Art of War. Surely somebody is a Go player Has a Go player ever connected the art of war to the notion of how you play Go strategically? I wonder, because I can't have been the first to do this. Not that I'm much of a Go player, but yeah, the chess parallel is pretty obvious. There's the center, which can be attacked from every direction. There's the squares that more easily influence the center and make it easier to move your pieces around without being so exposed as the center tends to be. Although center can change if there are many pawns still not exchanged. Um, I was playing a chess game, pretty serious chess match the other day. Game ran like 3 hours, and I noticed one condition in the terrain where I could easily take control both of the center and of the long diagonal surrounding the opponent's king. Um, my opponent was a very strong adversary at calculating things, but failed to appreciate this strategic nuance that's just a property of the terrain of the board. That, like, if there is a long diagonal that points at the opponent's king, and if you lose that bishop that controls that diagonal, it's going to be a tough time. So that, like, parallel comes across pretty easily in chess. But no, there's points in this chapter that go beyond, like, that go to talking about organization of your forces. Like, so considerations about terrain aren't going to fully override the notion that you can't just send a force, hurl it against another 10 times its size. Like, that's going to result in flight. You're not going to manage to sustain an attack with such a small force unless such a small force somehow is just extremely well prepared and the adversary is not. So yeah, even though there are considerations of terrain, they don't override all the other considerations, and I guess that's why there's elaboration, discipline, and insubordination and things like this, just to help you understand how to put things in proportion in practice. And that there is a notion, interesting in here, of a general who has a successful history. I'm scrolling through the document trying to find where, like, certainly the general who advances without coveting fame and retreats without fearing disgrace, etc., is the jewel of the kingdom, who has only the noblest causes in mind. So you'd rather not lose such a general to the opponent. You'd rather not lose such an officer who has the potential to be such a useful general under your kingdom in the event that you are king. But no, the general is the commander-in-chief in this era. But yeah, the one who only seeks to do the work for their sovereign is the jewel of the kingdom, so the king should appreciate such jewels that are willing to do the dirty work when necessary, who don't covet fame, and who appropriately retreat when reasonable, even though it might look disgraceful. Yeah, so those who are willing to do the dirty work, but also not afraid to retreat when appropriate, those should be valued by the sovereign. And there's a notion here that if fighting is sure to result in victory, then you must fight even though the ruler, the sovereign, forbid it. So it's the generals who are the ones making the military decision, not the sovereign. Although the sovereign may have quite a bit to say, um, but ultimately it's not their call, at least in this understanding of things. But now there was a point here about, where was it? A general who has a successful history. There's mention of the test of a great general who's able to assess the conditions. So the natural formation of the country is the soldier's best ally, but a power of estimating the adversary, of controlling the forces of victory, and of shrewdly calculating difficulties, dangers, and distances constitutes the test of a great general. So, despite whatever advantage might be formed by way of occupying the natural formation, occupying the high ground, or the preferable terrain that's easier to travel through, of somehow cornering the enemy who's not able to do the same thing, or at least not, as suggested earlier in this section, don't just proactively seek combat in equal conditions just because you can. There's a suggestion that attacking just because you can will put you at a disadvantage. I don't know that that's necessarily true, but it tells us that fighting in conditions that you perceive to be equal is not, although it might gain you glory and fame and whatever, it could also turn terribly against you. So, yeah, a general who understands the conditions and understands their army and puts everything well into practice wins their battles. Yeah, I'm failing to find this section in here which talks about the general and their experience over time. That's unfortunate. But yeah, common sense prevails. Who'd have thought? And it's not just like, well, I guess, yeah, there is a section in this document's Art of War that talks about the heavens and the earth. The heavens being the conditions that are generally in flux, like the weather. These things that are well beyond anyone's control and often beyond prediction. These two are able to influence the conditions, whereas terrain is thought to be the things that do not change. The things that you can have a well-formed knowledge and opinion about, but a general well understanding these and also understanding the conditions of their own army knows when it's appropriate to attack and knows when it's appropriate to not attack. So, anyway, I'm beating a dead horse here. I think it is interesting, however, like, many of the points in this section seem kind of obvious. So, the exciting part of the section's more about the nuance of, like, how much to prioritize. Yeah, understanding of terrain. That's why there are so many mentions of when conditions are obviously favorable, do this. When things are obviously disfavorable, don't attack. Because you can't really, I don't know how Sun Tzu would talk about the conditions where it's not clear what to do. These are the things, like, this work is many chapters long. It would be far, far longer a work if it could elaborate on every possibility. For example, what if there's high grounds, but then there's accompanying other terrains that are sometimes easy to travel in and out of, and other ones are not so easy to travel in and out of? Like, what if you have a complex terrain? How do you speak about this? Well, you look at your general's experience and your general that's well knowledged about these things is the successful general that the kingdom wants to keep around. The sovereign favors, that not only the sovereign, but their army likewise favors. So, yeah, there's only so much that you can put into writing to understand it well. There's not really an admonition or discussion here about how to communicate military intelligence from general to general as you're trade testing the new general. Perhaps I read this already, but yeah. Um, the power of estimating the adversary, etc., shrewdly calculating distances, dangers, and difficulties is the test of a great general. So there's not a mention of, okay, you can look at a general's history and see who has successfully passed the tests and who hasn't. But no, I think this succinctly puts together, like, you can see this is the test. If you are the sovereign, if you're other generals in discussion with a sovereign who may, I guess, have multiple generals. But then if, like, I don't understand the military structure in this day and age. Does a sovereign exclusively have one, or potentially two or three or four generals? Potentially this has changed and continues to change over time at the wisdom of the sovereign and of their generals. But yeah, you can see here are the tests of what makes a general great and what doesn't. And there's not elaboration upon, therefore, a general who has passed tests so many times is one that a sovereign of wisdom should keep or reward better or better support their army or so forth. Um, hmm. There is a notion in the previous note here that there are 6 ways of courting defeat, and these 6 ways must be carefully noted by the general who has attained a responsible post. So this suggests that a kingdom can have multiple generals, but then who's the general in charge in the event where generals have disagreements? Military operations are complex. Anywho, yeah, hopefully we've learned things about terrain, about keeping a well-organized army, about, like, pay careful attention to not go halfway toward victory. It's better to fully approach victory than go halfway toward it, but better sometimes halfway through toward victory than nothing. But yeah, the general who achieves a responsible post, great things are expected of, and a sovereign is wise to keep around those who are a service to the kingdom and not just seeking to embellish their own history with victory at any cost. Truly, military strategy is a complex subject. Perhaps this is why we enjoy strategy gaming so much, where things have been greatly reduced, so we feel empowered to handle these situations and solve problems in a rather practical way, in a way that might not be so easy in real life. We love our games. Everybody loves the games. It's a tradition throughout time. Songs, yeah. Are there any points to close with? If you know the enemy and know yourself, your victory will not stand in doubt. If you know heaven and you know earth, you may make your victory complete. So you can know the earth all you want. You can, there is a song, I'm not going to repeat it here, from a Disney movie. But yeah, being familiar with the earth has only so much value. There's a separate realm that, if you understand that well, or less charitably, if you are, um, if you can mitigate the circumstances of the heaven, if you can mitigate that randomness or whatever you choose to call it, in the event that you don't have divine inspiration, the atheists out there may, not in the sense of being derogatory toward atheists, but those who just cannot easily be inspired by the heavens can still find ways to deal with the practical challenges in the earth and mitigate temporary circumstances to their advantage and to everybody's advantage. But yeah, if you know heaven, um, one can imagine like a gambler going to a casino. If they know heaven, things can just perfectly work out in their favor. They might not perfectly know heaven, so it helps to likewise know the earth. But a perfect knowledge of the earth is still not enough. Your victory is complete when you know the heaven and you know the earth. So, yeah. Thanks to Sun Tzu for collecting these points together, helping us try to better understand military terrain, military organization in general, and the notion of the state and the sovereign, and having generals of responsible rank. There's a lot to take in. This document continues to get more confusing the further we read into it. Hopefully by the end we'll make better sense of it. Thanks for listening. Take care.